Hey, Mr. Morell.
Hey.
Nice
Good
meeting
to
you
see you
again.
again. Yeah.
Good to see you again.
Very good to see you.
Great. I still have two questions.
Sure.
So this time I brought some question about China. Have you been to China before?
Many times.
Many times, yeah. I read that you stayed like 14 years somewhere around China, or
No. What you read was that the first
as analyst.
the first 15, 16 years of my career, I focused on East Asia. So I did. I looked at all sorts of things in East Asia, mostly North Korea.
All right. So you were in United States, but you work on issue.
Correct.
All right. I just watched the video. I don't know when it was shot at the time, but it was on CNN, and you actually talk about a war with China is a risk. And you cited a study. I don't know what kind of book you read, but you said that historically 70% of the time the rising power will end up having war with a status quo power. So I just want to know what role CIA or U.S. intelligence community could play to hit that 30%.
So I don't think this is an intelligence issue. I think this is a policy issue. I think that the most important relationship in the world is the relationship between Washington and Beijing. The most important relationship for the future of East Asia and for the future of the world. It is very important that we get that relationship right, in my view. And the range of outcomes in that relationship between the United States and China ranges from cooperation at one end of the spectrum, the kind of cooperation we saw on climate change, all the way to war at the other end of the spectrum. So the possible outcomes here are huge. Okay, nobody wants to be down at that end. Right. Everybody wants to be over here. Right. I mean, it's in everybody's interest, right, to be over here. There are two things, in my view. There are two things that are pulling the United States and China in the right directions. In the right direction, towards this end of the spectrum. And there are two things that are pulling us in the wrong direction, towards this end of the spectrum. The two things pulling us in the right direction are, number one, that we both China and the United States, have a very significant interest in the success of the Chinese economy, particularly a reforming Chinese economy. It is good for China. It is good for the United States if the Chinese economy continues to do very, very well, contrary to what Donald Trump says, right? So that's one thing drawing us together. We both have a common interest in that. Okay. There's some politics around that in the United States that have to be managed, but that's a good thing. Okay. The second thing pulling us together is that increasingly the number of national security issues on which our interests overlap with China's is growing, and the number of national security issues on which our interests overlap, I believe, are much larger than the issues where our national security interests are in conflict. So that's something that draws us together. What's an example of that? The Chinese have as much interest, if not more interest, than the United States in the stability of the Middle East. Because the Chinese get much more of their energy from the Middle East than we do. So we both have a common interest there, right? There are, as these common interests grow and develop, there are opportunities for us to work together with them on the intelligence front, the diplomatic front, and even the military front, to manage these issues around the world. So that's something that's pulling us together. Okay, the two issues pulling us apart are, number one, we're both a little leery of each other, right? And we both have large militaries in the same place on the planet. So when you have large militaries in the same place on the planet, and you're a little leery of each other, You need to plan for war against each other. You need to equip yourself for war against each other, and you need to exercise. You need to exercise military exercises to prepare for war against each other, and both sides do. Both sides do all three of those things, right? And both sides see the other side doing those three things, right? That creates a natural tension in the relationship that is not healthy.
Yeah. So I just knew that in the Cold War's time, U.S. and USSR have this diplomatic espionage, and they know each other's capability, and they tend to have less conflicts because they have this sort of information symmetry. So my question about CIA is, we know that CIA do lots of analysis, so does that come into the picture?
Sure.
Like
sure. So
securing peace?
Sure, absolutely. So, our job, CIA's job, is to give the president, right, a picture of what's happening in China, what the Chinese are thinking, how they're thinking about this relationship that I just described, right? So that the president makes better decisions. And Chinese intelligence is trying to do the same thing with regard to us, right? They're trying to understand us, understand where we're coming from. Let me just finish the story though here, okay? So the second thing pulling us apart, you mentioned earlier, right? It's the fact that China is a rising power, and in East Asia, and the United States is a status quo power. Because China is the rising power, it wants a greater say in the world around it. That is a very natural thing, right? And guess who has that say today? The United States. So how does that get resolved? How does that issue get resolved, right? And that's where this study, and this is a study by the Harvard Kennedy School. They looked at every time in history where a rising power came up against status quo power, and that's where that 70% figure comes from, right? So the odds are not on our side here, is the point, right? This needs to be managed very, very carefully, right? And the intelligence services of the two countries have a role in this, and the diplomatic services of the two countries have a role in this, and the military services of the two countries have a role in this, right? The more cooperation, clearly everybody's looking at everybody else, but the more cooperation there is on those three things, the better off we'll be in this ending up in the right place. And my own personal view on this rising power, status quo power thing, is that there's a solution to this. The solution is for the United States to give China more room in the world around it, in exchange for the Chinese living by the rules of the international order, not making up new rules, right? So what's an example of where they are living, where they are playing by the rules, and what's an example of where they're not playing by the rules? China's creation of a development bank for East Asia is living by the rules, right? There's nothing wrong with that. It was, in my view, a mistake for the United States of America to oppose that. It's ridiculous, right? Because they're playing by the rules, right? They're just they're throwing their weight around in a positive way, I think you can say, right? Will they get more influence as a result of that? Yes. But are they playing by the rules? Yes. What the Chinese are doing in the South China Sea? Not playing by the rules. Not playing by the rules. You don't get to resolve border disputes militarily. You just don't. In the modern world, you just don't get to do that. So not only did I think the United States made a mistake in pushing back on what China was trying to do with the development bank, we made a mistake in not pushing back much, much harder on what the Chinese were doing in the South China Sea, because they're not playing by the rules there.
Yeah, so from your experience, in certain points of time between China and U.S., there were some very low points. Like in 1999, there was the accidental bombing of China embassy in Belgrade, and also in 2001 there was a Hainan Island accident where the EP3 was
know it very well
collided. So in that situation, I just want to have some perspective about the difference between President Hillary and President Trump in handling this crisis.
Yeah, so let's take the Hainan Island thing.
Yeah.
Okay. So the two planes bumped, right? A Chinese fighter and a U.S. reconnaissance plane. Okay?
Chinese pilot died. One Chinese pilot.
I don't know. Okay.
Yeah.
But the plane had to land on Hainan Island, and the Chinese held the crew and held the plane and asked for reparations for the Chinese aircraft and the Chinese pilot, right?
Yeah.
It took, and I was there. I was briefing President Bush every morning, right?
Yeah.
It took, in my view, incredible patience on the part of President Bush for this to end peacefully, right? Had he overreacted, it could have escalated the situation and led to a larger conflict between the two countries, right? So Secretary Clinton has George Bush's patience.
Yeah.
Donald Trump does not, right? Donald Trump shoots from the hip. He's got very thin skin. He reacts very quickly. He doesn't think through issues. So I'd be concerned, right, about a Donald Trump in that situation overreacting, not being patient, and leading to a larger conflict.
Yeah. So interesting thing is I read a poll. It's about several countries, if they were American citizen, who they were going to vote for. And the thing is, but Chinese still, all the country vote for Hillary more than for Trump. But in China, the edge of Hillary to Trump is only like single digit, but for most of other countries, like double digit. So I think, from my understanding, some of the Chinese, they say, well, Donald Trump is a businessman. He's not saying China is politically challenging U.S. He's talking about currency issue, talking about economic issue. That's easier to handle. But for Clinton, she made some comments on setting up some missile around China, so that might be tougher because it's about military, it's about political issue, it's about ideology issue. So,
but all that is wrong. What you just said.
Yeah.
All that's wrong.
Yeah,
right.
That's my interpretation of the public opinion.
So public opinion's wrong, right?
Yeah.
The missiles we're talking about are not aimed at China; they're aimed at North Korea. So all the missile defense that the U.S. is placing in East Asia is aimed at North Korea, and its development of long-range missiles that can hit the United States, and the ability to put a nuclear weapon on one. Now, I know the Chinese think, okay, not only are they aimed at North Korea, but they're also aimed at us, right? So I know where that view comes from, but it's just not true. It's just not true. And, the Chinese government, in my view, kind of fans the flames a little bit here in how it talks to its public about these issues. It turns out, right? It turns out that the one country in the world with any leverage whatsoever over North Korea to behave better is China, right? Is China. So and I've told the Chinese this. I have said what I'm going to say to you. I've said this to Chinese officials. If you don't want U.S. missile defense in East Asia, then push the North Koreans to negotiate away their nuclear program.
All right.
It's that simple.
Yeah.
It's that simple.
So that's one of the leverages U.S. have to push China to do something about North Korea. What are other?
Yeah, I mean, I would think that the direction North Korea is going, right, with its strategic military programs, nuclear and missiles, right, is not in the interest of the United States, but it's even more not in the interest of China. Because not only is the United States going to react to protect itself, right, from North Korea in the way I just described, with missile defense, with forward deployed missile defense, right? But the Japanese and the South Koreans are going to have to defend themselves too, right? And they're going to develop their own missile defense, which the Chinese aren't going to like. And I think eventually, if the North Koreans do not give up their nuclear weapons program, I think the Chinese and the South Koreans are going to seriously consider having their own nuclear weapons program. And I don't think that's in the interest of China at all.
Right.
So, and I've told this to the Chinese. I've told this to the Chinese, right? This is what is going to happen in East Asia unless you use your leverage against North Korea to get them to come to the negotiating table and have a serious negotiation about ending their nuclear program.
Yeah, that's going to be tough.
It's going to be tough, but China's the only country who's got the leverage.
Yeah, absolutely. So another front of possible tension is cyber war or economic espionage. It's being a headache between China and U.S., probably more headache for U.S. than for China. But there is a notion of legitimate state-sponsored espionage. So what is the acceptable limits on legitimate
that's a great question.
State-sponsored espionage?
So there's three bins of issues with regard to cyber. First is cyber espionage. There's legitimate cyber espionage, there's appropriate cyber espionage, and there's inappropriate cyber espionage. The appropriate cyber espionage is going after national defense secrets. You know, what countries have been spying on each other for centuries, right? What every country in the world does except a couple, right? For your national security, right? Focused on your national security. That's legitimate, appropriate in my view. We shouldn't have any restrictions on that, right? Countries should be able to do what they do. So, for example, when China stole all the security files of U.S. government employees from the Office of Personnel Management, my reaction to that was good for Chinese intelligence. They're doing their job, right? The problem was the lack of security at the Office of Personnel Management, the lack of cybersecurity, right? So because if I could steal that same information from China, I would, in a heartbeat. Okay, that's legitimate. That's legitimate. Those are legitimate intelligence targets. Okay. What's inappropriate? Stealing intellectual property and giving it to your companies, right, to give them an economic advantage. There are very, very few countries in the world that do that. China does. We need to get to a place where everybody in the world accepts that that is inappropriate. What I would do is I would make it, and I've recommended this, and if I ever get back into government, I'm going to push this idea. I would make it an unfair trade practice under the WTO. If a country's caught, as China was, stealing intellectual property from U.S. steel companies and giving it to their steel companies, so they were caught doing this a year ago, I would take that to the WTO, and that would be considered an unfair trade practice, and Chinese firms would face a tariff then selling their products to the United States for a certain period of time to make up the value of what they stole. So I would make that a unfair trade practice, and it would stop. It would stop then, right? The other two bins, very quickly, are cyber crime. Both we and China have a interest in ending cyber crime, and the Chinese are not encouraging cyber crime the way the Russians and some countries in Eastern Europe are.
Hacking,
right? Hacking for profit, right? Chinese don't do that. And if any Chinese organized crime is doing that, then we should have an expectation that the Chinese government take action, right? And I think they would, because it's not in their interest either. And then the third is cyber war, right? So preparing for cyber war. We should talk about that more, but I think there's some aspects of cyber war that are legitimate, and there's some aspects of cyber war that are illegitimate. But we should talk about that some other time.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Great.
Right.
And maybe I can send it to you.
Sure. Good. All right.
All right.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.